Hello everyone, we are back today with our needs analysis lecture. So basically this is something that you need to do before you start working with a client or an athlete or a team. You need to analyze the needs of that specific athlete or those specific athletes. And by doing this, you will have to answer 3 questions. The 3 big questions are: what are the metabolic demands? What are the biomechanical demands? And what are the common injuries that are observed in this sport profile? Basically, when you answer all 3 of these questions, you want to make sure that your choices closely resemble the sport's movement and energy system demands, and that it addresses any weaknesses, typical injuries, and promotes overall balance. All right, we'll start off with energy system. Also, what we mentioned earlier, the metabolic demands, those are kind of synonymous. First, we're going to start with what is ATP. I'm sure all of you have heard of it at this point, hopefully. Adenosine triphosphate is what that stands for. This is basically a substrate that can be broken down and used for energy. So there are 3 different energy systems. The first is phosphagen, and that system uses our stored ATP. So it's really quick and really fast. There's not a whole lot stored, and we'll get into that soon. The next one is glycolytic. So this is the breakdown of carbohydrates to resynthesize ATP. So this is our second one because it takes a little bit longer to do that process. So that energy system's the midway. So it's not as quick, but you can also only sustain it for a certain amount of time. And then the last one, which you can sustain the longest, is the oxidative system. So the primary source of ATP here, oxygen, helps us resynthesize this at rest and then a low steady state intensity. So you need to start analyzing with this information. If you are working with a sprinter or you are working with a marathon runner, you are not going to train them the same because they have different time demands for their sport. So someone who runs marathons is going to be primarily in the oxidative energy system, low and slow, and then someone who's a sprinter is primarily going to be in the phosphagen, potentially glycolytic on how long the sprints are. And here is our little table for you. So if you look to the left, this is our duration. 0 to 6 seconds for our phosphagen, 30 seconds to 2 minutes for our glycolytic, and anything over 3 minutes for our oxidative. So if you're thinking we skipped seconds 7 to 29, that's not because we're not using an energy system at that point. That's because there's a lot of overlap here. So you're never 100% in one for your entire event. You know, you're going to start off in one, then move into another. There's a primary energy system that you use, so you need to pay attention to that. So there are percentages of the energy systems that you're in between the 6 seconds and the 30 seconds and between the 2 and 3 minutes. So don't get that wrong on a text. Really pay attention that it is over 3 minutes on the oxidative. A lot of people will put in a 2 minutes there because the last glycolytic system left off on that 2-minute mark. So when we're looking at intensity, the intensity for phosphagen is extremely high, but it doesn't last long. The intensity for our glycolytic is also high, still not really lasting more than 2 minutes. And then oxidative is low. You can sustain it for a long period of time. So when you are programming for your athletes, you need to pay attention all the way to the right, our work to rest ratio. If you're working at a super high intensity, you need way more rest to resynthesize and readapt and just come back to baseline and let your body do the appropriate thing that it needs to, because you cannot maintain an extremely high intensity for that long. Your body doesn't have the capabilities to stay in that energy system without oxygen. So if you do try to stay at an extremely high intensity, your body's going to bring you down to a lower intensity because it's just not going to be able to meet the demands that you're trying to put on it. We are back with our question 2, biomechanical analysis. These are just a few of the questions you need to think about when you're trying to decide what are the major movement patterns for my sport. What are the big muscle groups that are targeted? What kind of muscle actions dominate this? Eccentric, that lengthening of the muscle. The isometric, that contraction, that's a steady, still contraction. And then the concentric, where your muscles are shortening. You need to think about the joints that are involved. Is this primarily a shoulder sport? Do I have a pitcher? Do I have a football player doing more horizontal pushes? Do I have a swimmer doing a little bit more pulling? And then you need to look at the duration of the event as well when you're programming for your biomechanical movements. So an example over to the right, if you look at this chart, we'll just stay with the top task, the ladder raise. This is for a firefighter. So how do I mimic a ladder raise? The exercises that I'm going to do, a lunge with a dumbbell shoulder press. Turkish get up is also really good for this. So then when I want to break it down further, I'm going to look at the muscle and joint action. So for this specific movement, I have hip flexion and extension, static scapular retraction, unilateral hip, knee, and ankle extension. And then I also need to pay attention to the plane of motion that I'm working in, which is sagittal. All right, and then I'm not going to make you guys listen to me read through the rest. You can pause and take notes, but this is really going to help you if you can make a chart like this for your athlete and think about all of the movements that they do, what exercises would mimic that most, and then the muscle actions and joint actions and the planes of motions that they work in. All right, here is another example. If you look over to our left for our movement pattern, such as basketball dribbling and passing, related exercises, close grip bench press, dumbbell bench press, tricep pushdown, reverse curl, or hammer curl. So there are plenty of sources that you can look to and reference that will start making you just a little bit more quick at analyzing the sport movement and then seeing how you can translate and be specific to that movement in the weight room. All right, we are here with common injuries. What I want you guys to do first when you're working with a new team is to go to the athletic trainer that works with that team and ask them what the common injuries are for that sport. Most likely they're going to have a lot more knowledge on that than you are because that is their scope of practice. So as a practitioner, you want to make sure that you're really balancing your program. If you have an athlete where the sport is mostly pushing, you want to make sure you're kind of balancing them out with pulls so they don't become too dominant in one area and then weak in another area. You want to keep the movements clean. And you want to scale if a movement doesn't look good. So here's an example of a movement that doesn't look good that should never be allowed to happen. If you see that, that is knee valgus, okay? So what happens if you allow that to persist? ACL tears, which are really common in females because of that Q angle, which is the angle from their hip down to their knee. They have wider hips. So if you see that, you need to correct it, and you need to correct it fast. Don't let it go on. This is a quick little correction. Just a kettlebell in between the legs cleans up that valgus because it kind of pushes the knees out when you have to put a weight in between. So that's a simple correction. If it doesn't fix there, then you need to take them back even farther. But just make sure that you're being assertive with your athletes and you're not allowing them to do faulty movement patterns because it's your responsibility as a coach to make sure that excellence is maintained. All right, we are to the backup plan, and every coach needs to have a backup plan. If you don't have a backup plan, you're going to spend a lot of time and energy stressing out about it when the coach tells you he doesn't want to do what you planned. So the main ruler or leader, decision maker in strength and conditioning, actually it falls back on the sport coach. So when you come up with this beautifully perfect plan for your team, and your sport coach says, you know what, I don't really want to do that. Can we do this instead? You can first obviously explain in a very respectful way the meaning and the goals and the intention behind your plan, and maybe you get them on your page. But if you don't, then you're just going to have to pivot with your backup plan and meet the coach in the middle between doing what you know is best for the athletes and doing what the coach wants you to do for the athletes. So another thing that you need to think about before is what your available resources are. You don't want to have to get into a position where you have a perfectly outlined plan and then you get to this new fitness center and they don't have some of the equipment that you need. Also, the time availability. Are there other teams going to be in there? Are there other classes from different programs such as the exercise science program? Are they in there using some equipment? So always make sure that you're scheduling and you're planning ahead so you don't get caught without your plan B and your backup plan and then you put yourself in a stressful situation. Another thing to think about with resources is work schedules, your life demands, athletes' life demands, your budget availability, which is always less than you want it to be, the athlete schedule, the facility schedule, the university schedule, and then this is a big one that's going to impact you a lot is NCAA regulations. And then if you're working with a high school or high school regulations, there's certain times where you can't be practicing with the coach inside or outside of season, and you need to make sure that you are following along with those regulations. So, to sum up, do not get too attached to your plan because it will change. And you should be evolving constantly because you should be constantly learning. I've been teaching for 9 semesters now, and I can tell you that not one of my classes has stayed the exact same because there's always something that I'm learning or I'm finding that's better for people in my class, better ways for them to learn, better ways to do things. So if you're not constantly evolving and improving yourself, you're not improving yourself for your team, for your athletes, for your students, for whoever you're with, whoever you work with. You need to constantly be pushing that limit. Not that you shouldn't ever be content with life, but just don't be complacent and just know that there's always a better way to do things and that you always have room for growth and improvement.